Everybody. My name is Sarah Ryan, and welcome to Psychology from My Kitchen. Today's topic, we are looking at the roots of psychology. So, where has psychology come from? Where did it all stem from? How did we get to this point? So, a little bit of history of psychology. So, first of all, in order to really understand history of psychology, we have to first establish, well, what exactly is psychology? So, psychology has a very specific definition, and that is the scientific study of behavior and mental process. Or sometimes you might hear it say that it is the scientific study of behavior and the mind, or something like that, but still really the same thing. We got to break that down a little bit because there's three distinct parts here to what psychology is. So, first of all, we're stating that it is a scientific study. Psychology sometimes gets a bad rap, or it's sometimes referred to as like a soft science and that sort of thing, or some people think that it's all kind of made up or mumbo jumbo kind of a deal, and what's going on with that. So, first of all, in order for something to be considered a science, really all you need is that your methodology for answering and for asking and answering questions is going to be to utilize the scientific method. And in psychology, we utilize the scientific method, which of course you guys know what that is. I'm going to ask a question and formulate my hypothesis and conduct experiments and collect data and analyze. I'm going to do all those things. That's what science is. And that in science, I might find out more information so that what I knew in the past isn't relevant because I've come out with new, better science. And so that's really the nature of science. And so in psychology, we consider this a science because we utilize this scientific method to ask and answer our questions. Now, a lot of you probably take psychology as part of a social studies or a social studies credit like in your high school. And in fact, I'm a licensed social studies teacher. So what's the deal? How come these two things are different? You're telling me it's a science, but I might not actually learn it in a science department. What's going on? Well, first of all, social studies is sort of a misnomer. It's a term that we often utilize, especially at the elementary school level, where we're talking about a whole host of human behaviors that also includes history, but I might look at government as well as geography. And actually, these are social sciences. And that in a social science, I am studying human beings, but I'm using scientific methodology in order to do that. And so, in a lot of ways, I like to think of psychology as kind of the ultimate social science because I'm studying human beings, right? I'm studying behavior and I'm studying mental process. So, um, our definition of psychology, including this scientific study, and this is kind of how we came to that point. But now we've got our other two parts, this behavior and mental process. So, this wasn't always our definition of psychology. In fact, psychology as it started wasn't really hung up on the science thing. That came a little bit later. But its initial view was on the study of mental process, it was the study of the mind. And that's all well and good because the study of the mind, we want to start with that one, it's what's going on up in my head. It's the cognitive process and abilities that I experience every single day. And some of our major cognitions are going to include things like thinking, okay, because I think and you think too, right? So our thought process and our problem solving. Um, Another big cognitive process is going to be my memory. So the fact that I can keep information in my mind, that I can pull it out at a later time after I've learned it, that is a major mental process that I'm going to be able to do. I'm going to be able to understand, I'm going to be able to comprehend what's going on around me as part of that thinking, but also as part of the memory piece I have. Um, Another major aspect of my cognitive process is actually going to be dreaming. That I am capable of not only sleeping, but then also experiencing all these uh, thoughts and things like that while I am asleep. Um, so we have this series of mental processes that we have going on. So that's what's going on inside of my head. Okay, all of my ability that I have going on inside of my head. That is my mental process, which is all well and good, but there's a little bit of a problem with that. I can't see inside your head, right? I mean, we can look at somebody and be like, I think they're thinking about this, but we don't know, right? I mean, have you ever had the experience where somebody starts telling you about their dream and you're like, yeah, cool, dude, right? I mean, even if you were in there, they're like, oh my gosh, you were there, and you're like, yeah, okay. We can't see inside each other's minds. Now, we're getting better at that because of different types of brain technologies and things like that that we have, and we'll talk about that later. But I can't really see what you're thinking about. And I can't see the memory that you have about, kindergarten or your first dog. I mean, I don't I don't see what's going on in your mind. And so while we initially start out in this thought that psychology is the study of mental process, we don't really have much to go on with that. And so that definition of psychology as the study of mental process, it actually goes away in the 1920s. We're going to get into that further here in just a minute. So instead, it's the scientific study of behavior, because how I behave, well, I behave in relation to what I'm thinking about, right? Like what is cognitively going on in my mind? Like, oh, another thought, emotions, right? If I get really angry, you probably know that I'm pretty angry because I might start displaying angry behaviors, right? I might yell. I might uh, have kind of like aggressive gestures and things like that. I mean, being female, and if you're male, maybe there is a problem with you understanding that I'm angry because I'm just like, I'm fine. And most people would know that I'm probably not fine, right? But I'm going to demonstrate a behavior. And so if I can't see what's going on inside of a person's mind, well, I sure as heck am going to be able to see what kind of behaviors that they're doing. And more importantly, back to the science part, I can measure behavior. I can count how many times the behavior happens. So if I'm thinking about like, oh, somebody, I'm studying happiness, well, you can't see inside of my mind how frequently I may or may not be happy, but you could see how many times I smile. You could see how many times I act kindly towards another person. And you could count that. You could measure it. You could determine that it happens so many times per hour or something like that. And so behavior and that psychology becoming the study of behavior allows me the opportunity to scientifically study and measure what's going on with human beings. And so now today, our current definition of psychology, the scientific study of behavior and mental process, it's combining those things together. Because in psychology, I am very much interested in why people do the things that they do, right? Why do we behave that way? Why is it that this person in this situation is going to act this way, whereas this person in this situation acts this way, or they act the same? How did that happen? Right? They could be two random people who've never met each other and then they're put in the exact same situation and they respond exactly the same way. That's weird, right? How did this happen? And so in psychology, I am studying that. I am asking the question about why do we do the things that we do? And so I have scientific study of behavior and mental process. Pretty cool stuff, right? So we're going to do a little trip down history lane here to see how did we come to this current definition of psychology. So believe it or not, we actually start with the ancient Greeks, and that this concept, why do people do the things that they do? This isn't really, all that new. This is something that as a species, we have been curious about for a significantly long period of time. And we actually start by looking at some of our ancient Greek philosophers, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. So, one of the big things that happens with Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle is they ask two major questions. One is the idea about the mind, or if you're religious, you might consider this to be your soul. Is it separate from the body, or is it one, right? That does my mind or my soul continue to exist after my physical body no longer does so? And Socrates and Plato had the argument that it could, that your mind was something that was separate from the body, and that even if your physical body was gone, your mind would be able to continue because it is separate. And they also believed that when a person was born, they were born with all of the knowledge that one would need to have in order to live, that knowledge was born within you. And this is actually going to become the basis of a controversial topic in psychology that you might have heard of before, and that is the nature versus nurture debate. That is, am I the way I am because of the way I'm born? Or am I the way I am because of my experiences, because of my environment? So Socrates and Plato are making this argument that my mind and my body are separate from one another, and that my mind continues even after my physical body is gone. And they're also arguing that I am born with all the knowledge that I need within me. They're on the nature side of the debate. But Aristotle, who comes after them, is making the exact opposite argument. He's arguing that your soul or your mind couldn't be separate from your body because it is in your body. And it only exists because your body exists. And that if my body discontinued, right, I died, that there would be no mind to have. And so that they are one with each other, that your soul or your body are not separate from one another. And he also made the argument that your knowledge, it comes from your experiences. It depends on the environment, that nurture piece, that you store this in your memory, and that is how you're going to survive this world, is based on the experiences that you have had. And so Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle are really making some significant arguments that we still talk about today in psychology. But because of some world history stuff, we don't really, get to do anything. I mean, Socrates and Aristotle and Plato, they didn't have any real way of studying this. So we got to skip ahead a little bit. So you might know from your world history classes that you look at like the Roman Empire and the fall of the Roman Empire, and that Western Europe falls into what's known as the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, that it might be referred to. That my greatest concern in life is basically survival. That I am very interested in surviving and procreating, and that's basically all that life is about, because I don't have the time and resources to be focused on anything beyond that. And so things like education and knowledge aren't a super huge priority, as well as the fact that a lot of that information was controlled by the church. And then in the getting into the 1400s, 1500s, we start having the Renaissance period, where we have renewed interest in art and music and culture, because there's suddenly a lot more food for people to eat, so I'm not as, concerned about dying every day, and that I can put my energies towards other things. And that starts ushering in our Enlightenment period. And during the Enlightenment, you have a breaking from the church, and that in doing so, we have a renewed engagement in science and scientific knowledge, and a greater curiosity into humans as well as human behavior. So one of these people in the Enlightenment period is a Frenchman by the name of Rene Descartes. And Rene Descartes is very interested in the idea of how does the body communicate with itself. And this was pretty revolutionary at the time, that we're still believing that God controls our fate and he's going to control our behavior. We've been believing in evil spirits, and Descartes like, well, something physically has to be going on here. And so he's becoming interested in the human body and how the human body works, which, by the way, is very difficult to study when it is a crime for you to desecrate a body where you can't really look at how it works. Like, on a dead body, that's a big problem. So Descartes wants to know about communication. And he's actually, we're going to say that he's on the right track. Okay, he's pretty wrong with some things, but he's getting there. So this picture right here is actually a really famous one from Rene Descartes. And you'll see that there is something going on up in the noggin, and that there is some kind of pathway that's going from the foot and the hand, and it's going up into the mind. So Descartes is one of the first people to propose the idea of nerves, and that your nerves are going to be communicating with your brain, which is actually true. Okay, like that's how you understand that things are going on. Like, I understand that my water is cold because I can feel it on my skin. It's being processed in my brain. Okay. So Descartes, he publishes this, but where he goes a little awry is that he thinks that it is fluid from the brain running through your nerves, and he called that fluid your animal spirits, which we're going to learn how nerves are not hollow tubes. Okay, and it's not really fluid that's going on, it's electricity. But he thought it was like these animal spirits that are, running through your body. That's not right. But he also believed that these animal spirits are gonna create memories, and that memories are created in the brain. So yes, he's right. Memories are created in the brain, but not from animal spirits. Okay, again, electricity. So that's pretty revolutionary, though. Okay, and so we recognize Descartes as being one of these enlightened thinkers who is really going to start paving the way for psychology here in the next couple of years. Now, another empirical thinker, or somebody from the Enlightenment that you've probably heard of, is a guy by the name of John Locke. And we often recognize John Locke as talking about like the universal rights of man, making arguments for democracy and things like that. And Locke is also going to throw his hat into that nature versus nurture debate. And he refers to this as empiricism, and that the idea of the mind at birth, this is his quote, the mind at birth is a blank slate for which experience to write upon. So he's on the nurture side of the argument. And this is actually a really enlightened idea, because it's not like I'm supposed to be born, I'm not ordained by God to be a king, right? That it's based on my experiences, and this is an argument for democracy because men and women should have the right to govern themselves. And so that's why John Locke is really pushing for this idea of nurture, that it is your environment that is actually going to create who you are. So this is all well and good, but we still don't quite have psychology yet. And so the concept of psychology is being kicked around a little bit in Europe as well as in the United States, who are going to be our two big players when it comes to the creation of psychology. But the first person that we often identify as being, the first bit in psychology is a German by the name of Wilhelm Wundt. So Wilhelm Wundt in 1879 is credited with creating the very first psychological experiment. And in his psychological experiment, he's actually testing reaction time, and that he's asking people to, it's like there's a ball that drops and you have to hit a button when you hear the ball drop. And there's a difference between just reacting to the ball dropping and processing in your mind that the ball has dropped. And what he found was that these people who were asked to recognize that they've heard the ball drop, they were slower in their reaction time and hitting the button because they're timing this. And really what Wilhelm Wundt did, the very first person, was he measured a thought. He measured a thought, the very first person to do this, to identify that thinking, in the process of thinking, it takes some time to do. And so Wilhelm Wundt is credited with this first laboratory experiment in psychology. So the late 1800s, really beginning in the 1870s, there's been this renewed excitement into the world of psychology, but we often recognize that it's with Wilhelm Wundt that psychology really gets its start. So some early psychologists to note. So one of Wilhelm Wundt's students is a guy by the name of Edward Titchener. And in the 1890s, Edward Titchener is going to leave Germany and he's going to come over to the United States and go to Cornell and introduce the idea of what becomes known as structuralism. And so in the hard sciences, okay, that are happening at the time, things like chemistry and physics, their big concern is to try to discover the elemental structures of the world, right, of the universe. And so like in chemistry, this is where we have the introduction of the periodic table of elements and, finding all the elements, putting them in this table, all of that good stuff. And Titchener believes that we should be able to do the same thing with the mind, that we should be able to find the elemental structures of the mind, which is great, okay. Minor problem is that Titchener has no real way of studying this. So his methodology that he attempted to use was something that he called introspection. And in introspection, he was supposed to take a subject and they were supposed to very eloquently describe their experience when they looked at or if they listened to a particular object. So it's like, what do you think and feel with your Costco water, right? Like, I think it's cold and it helps hydrate me. Like, there isn't a whole lot that I might say about a bottle of water, right? So that's not really going to give me these elemental structures of the mind. So Titchener, good idea, okay, but he doesn't have any real places to go with it. So that's one of our early psychologists. Another early psychologist, and this is worth noting in the United States, is our first major American psychologist, and it's a guy by the name of William James. Now, William James is maybe a little bit full of himself because he often talked about how the very first psychology textbook he ever read was one that he wrote himself. But William James is more interested in like, how did we evolve as human beings? How did we evolve the functions of thoughts and feelings? Why do we have them? And he's heavily influenced by the work of Charles Darwin, whom I'm sure you have heard of with, the evolution, the theory of evolution, right? That we evolve in order to survive, and that, this was a big thing as to why human beings are going to think and feel and behave the way that they do, which is great. Okay, again, William James, good idea. He refers to this as functionalism, right? So the function of the mind is to aid in survival, which is not exactly wrong, okay? But again, William James doesn't have any way to prove this. And so again, it's a good thought, but we can't really go anywhere with it. But William James, being this kind of gregarious figure, is going to be a huge proponent of psychology, is going to really be pushing for psychology to be more popularized, something that other people should know about. He is actually going to work at Harvard, which it should be noted that in the United States, the two major universities that focus in psychology are actually going to be Harvard and Stanford. So at Harvard, William James is also really noted for admitting a woman into his class, and it's a woman by the name of Mary Whiton Calkins. Now, because of the way of the world at that point in time, all the guys who were in the class dropped out, you know, can't learn next to a lady, had all those lady vibes that, we give off and get in the way of learning. So William James is going to teach Mary Whiton Calkins basically everything that he knows about psychology. She finishes all the requirements for a PhD, and Harvard refuses to give it to her because we don't give those to ladies. She actually is going to go on to become the first female president of the American Psychological Association. So that might be something worth noting about psychology, and this is conspiracy theory me. Another reason why there might be a lot of flack that psychology gets is that from a very early standpoint, women have been very, very involved in the study of psychology. And in fact, if you look at the dynamic of male and female ratios, you have way more females who are involved in psychological science. So when we talk about like STEM careers and things like that, one of the places where women have historically been heavily involved is the scientific study of psychology. So that I think is just something kind of interesting about that. Again, Margaret Floyd Washburn, another woman, early ages. When we look at some other figures in psychological history, we look at in the 1870s in the United States, because this is back when William Wundt is doing his research in Germany. We have the first degree that we give in psychology as part of the Department of Philosophy at Harvard, and that goes to a guy named G. Stanley Hall. He's going to be one of the founders of the American Psychological Association. Another person worth noting, again female, is a woman by the name of Dorothea Dix. So one of the major focuses of psychology has always been in the area of mental illnesses. So we know that psychological disorders have always been a thing. Okay, they've always been around. But it was Dorothea Dix who really started to change the conversation about the treatment of those with mental illness, and that they should be treated as others with other medical illnesses are. So it's taking the idea of a psychological disorder as being like possessed by the devil sort of a thing, and that this is somebody who is sick, they need hospital treatment. That doesn't necessarily mean that they got better, but it was a real change in the conversation about the humane treatment towards people with psychological disorders. So then we come to probably the most controversial figure in psychology, and that is an Austrian physician by the name of Sigmund Freud. So many of you have probably heard of Freud before, and you probably know some of his concepts and not even realize that they were Freudian. So Sigmund Freud is a doctor, okay? He's a physician. He caters to the upper middle class, wealthy class of Vienna, Austria, and he starts to realize that a lot of his clients don't have anything what he thinks to be physically wrong with them. So he thinks that there's mentally something going on. And so he publishes his work based off of these experiences with his patients, um, not scientifically based at all. But he publishes all this stuff about why people do the things that they do. And it's very controversial. There is a lot of issues with childhood. There's a lot of issues with sexuality, which at the time was something that people did not talk about. Okay. And so while Freud isn't a psychologist, he is going to make psychology wildly popular. People are eating this stuff up. They want to know as much about psychology as they possibly can. They're reading his works a lot. There's a lot of stuff about dreams. So even today, if you go on to like dream websites and things like that, they are often citing his work still. And so he popularizes psychology and he makes it part of the popular culture. Okay, so terminology and things like that. So if I were to say, like, you see my doorway right there. If I were to say somebody's head was so big they could barely fit through my doorway, I'd be talking about their ego, right? Somebody who's really full of themselves, and I'm referring to their head. Why am I doing that? Because Freud told me to, right? That's one of his concepts. So there's all kinds of things in our popular culture that deal with Sigmund Freud. So we learn about him later on because there's some stuff, okay? But he is going to believe that our behavior stems from our unconscious mind, things that we don't really think about. But again, he has no way to prove this, and he has somebody who really doesn't like him. And that's this guy named John B. Watson. So John Watson vehemently disagrees with Sigmund Freud. And one of the major reasons why is because he wants psychology to be taken seriously as a science. And so if we're going to do this as a science, we got to be using science. Okay, we have to use that scientific methodology. And so this is really starting in like the 1920s. And Watson is going to push for the use of the scientific method, the use of data. And this is where we see psychology changing its focus more on the behavior, because I can see behavior, I can measure behavior. So psychology being something where like I can watch rats in a maze and that sort of thing. That's going to be Watson, okay? And then later, another behavioral psychologist is a guy named B.F. Skinner, who, again, we learn more about them later on in the year. So my behavior is a reflection of mental process. This pretty much sticks for a couple of decades until we really start getting into the 1960s, because there's some big things that start happening in the 1960s, especially in psychology. One is that our technology is going to improve, where I can actually start seeing some things that are going on in the brain with our first computerized technology. The first, of course, is going to be the EEG, the electroencephalogram. But we also have a new sense of studying thought as well as studying behavior, and a renewed sense in like what psychology is going to be all about. And so two major figures in the 1960s are going to be Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow, and their focus is on something called humanism. And in humanism, the belief is that our behavior as human beings is a way to better ourselves. So like, why do I do certain behaviors? I'm doing certain behaviors because I want to be better, okay? I want to improve. I want to fulfill my potential. So I want to be a happy, healthy individual. And so my behavior is going to be focused on getting there. And so we have, again, that scientific study, but back to the behavior and mental process. I'm putting both of those things together now in the 1960s. Then we go from there. And we are still at that point. We still are going to focus significantly on the science, and science is always changing, because as I study something over and over again, I find more data and I find new ways in which a person might behave. And so behaviors can change over time, and we look at that and we look at reasons why, is that something that is genetic? Is that something that is because of the environment and how it changes? And that's really one of the exciting things about psychology. So we're going to stop there for today. In our next lesson, we're going to revisit these different perspectives in psychology and look at how they influence um, us asking and answering our questions about why do we do the things that we do. So until next time, have a great day.